Hi, my name is Lana Shaw. I'm the research manager at the Southeast Research Farm, which is in the southeast corner of Saskatchewan, located near Redvers. And I've been there for about 10 years. We have a program that is producer directed. The farm is a nonprofit directed by farmers, and it's been in operation for over 20 years. We do trials on a wide variety of crops. I've become known as a subject matter expert on intercropping and cover crops and some of the more complex combinations of crops that are possible. We do grow a lot of other monocrops as well in trials, just to try to give people all kinds of information that they might need as farmers. I come from a farming background in Saskatchewan. This is my grandfather. He farmed his entire life, and when he started farming, they were using horses. I think they had some tractors maybe when he first started, but they were farming with horses. They farmed in a very different way at the start of his career than they did by the end in the late 90s and early 2000s. His farming career was characterized by massive change. We sometimes think of the agriculture industry as being very incapable of big changes, but they do happen. We are capable of large changes, but it takes major forces to make it happen. And often there's generational changes, so that oftentimes it's not your oldest farmers that are open to these changes, it's some of the younger ones. There's always new generations coming up in farms that want to try to do things in new ways. Intercropping is one of the ways that we're remaking farming. So a lot of people were doing no-till in the 90s and 2000s. It was new. My grandpa did not really think that that was good. He thought that tilling the soil a lot and summer following, leaving the land bare half the time, was the way to farm. And my father, who's still farming, largely is continuous cropping and is doing no-till practices. So these were things that changed over time. There's a move to some new, more diverse practices, and that presents some challenges, but there are a lot of farmers that are up for those challenges. When I talk about intercropping, that's a big, we need to define terms. What is intercropping? Intercropping is basically intentionally growing more than one species in an agricultural plant setting. So that does include forages. It includes things that we like alfalfa and grasses growing together for hay. That's still a type of intercropping, but it's not the type that I generally get asked to talk about. What I usually get asked to talk about is mixed grain intercropping. There's a lot of intercropping that goes on in the world in different places. It varies from alley cropping with agroforestry to strip cropping. There's times where people will grow 3 rows of a particular crop and then 2 rows of another one. Sometimes those are hand harvested. So in our scenario, in our context, we are not going to be hand harvesting crops. We're going to be mechanically harvesting crops. So that puts a particular set of restrictions on how we can intercrop, but it doesn't mean that we can't intercrop. It just means that there's particular ways to go about it. The fast crop, slow crop is a maneuver that would be familiar to people that grow forages, because often you can underseed a grain crop to a forage species and then harvest that forage species later on, either for forage or for a seed, for forage seed. So that's not new, it's familiar, but it's a type of intercropping, and with the new emphasis on soil health, new emphasis on diversity that we have in agriculture, we can embrace and understand some of those older practices better and understand how they might be helping our agriculture system. Relay cropping is another one that is in use more in the United States right now. It's pretty cool. They can seed winter wheat or fall rye in the fall, then seed some soybeans into it in the spring, harvest the fall rye and winter wheat carefully trying to minimize damage to the soybeans, and then later take off a soybean crop. So it's basically like having double cropping, but in an area where double cropping isn't really possible. So you're overlapping two crops. So this is a big umbrella of intercropping. All of that counts as intercropping. For this presentation, I'll talk some about it, mixed intercropping, because this is a way up north. I think it's worthwhile also talking about some of the fast crop, slow crop, so that you can look at some of these forages and forage seed production that might be a really good fit for your area. I get asked, why mixed grain intercropping? Why would you intentionally seed more than one crop at a time? This goes against every rule of traditional farming. Normally, when you're driving along the highway, you want to be able to tell what crop that is. And if your neighbors drive along and can't tell what crop you have there, and there's multiple crops growing, they will think that someone has done something wrong. Colin Rosengren is a longtime intercropper and pretty well known in Saskatchewan for intercropping. When people ask him, why are you intercropping? He turns it around and says, why not? Why are we not doing this? There are obstacles, but they're surmountable. There are ways of managing this as a large-scale, efficient, mechanized agriculture. There's some significant things that have to be adapted, but it is entirely possible when it's done with some advanced planning. There are multiple observed benefits. This is an example. I've listed a reference that summarizes some of the findings on intercropping. But in general, most of the time, it increases total productivity. So productivity is your yield. It reduces pests. It doesn't eliminate them, but it tends to reduce things like diseases and insect pest pressure, or mitigates them. In some circumstances, it can improve harvestability. That can also backfire, so that's something to just watch and be careful with. The harvestability is largely related to reduced lodging. But it also can mean that a crop threshes more easily in a mixture than as a monoculture. Risk mitigation. If you're growing more than one species of crop in the same field, oftentimes that means there's less risk of one of those failing. And sometimes crops fail just in certain portions of the field. So you can have different proportions of the crops depending on slope, position, or moisture conditions within very different landscape positions in the field. Ecosystem services. That's a big area that is not well understood yet. Crops support biodiversity both in the soil and insect diversity that isn't in the soil, and having more biodiversity in your crop means that you're supporting more biodiversity in the ecosystem that is where your crop lives. And that might include things broader outside of just that land base. But the soil health and the biological activity that's associated with our cropland is something that people are becoming far more aware of. Within the ecosystem services, I think we can also include things like erosion and damage to soil. So these are all things that arguably are improved with intercropping. This is not an easy process. It is learning intensive. It's you have to have some tolerance for making mistakes, figure out how much you can afford to risk in learning some new things if it's experimental. There's no recipe, there's no plug and play answers. Even for farmers that are located half an hour away from my research farm, I have no plug and play, here's your recipe, go to it kind of answers. It requires them to pay a lot of attention to detail, tweak things as they go. When I'm talking to people that, like you, that are very far from where I currently do research, I can give you some ideas, and tell you what you need to think about, but this is a process that you need to be prepared for if you want to take it on. It is a big change. People tend to want significant changes in agriculture, but want other people to make them. And this is something where you take on the change. You are being the change in the system, and that's an uncomfortable process. It takes some time to get used to that amount of learning and uncertainty and unpredictability. So where do you start? You actually don't start with your crops. You start somewhat with yourself and try to decide, what are you trying to accomplish by intercropping? Are you trying to improve your biodiversity, improve soil health, improve profitability? Some of those goals will compete with each other. So you need to figure out how to balance those, figure out what success looks like for you, and what is your timeline for being able to achieve that. How many acres are you going to play with in order to try something new here? You need to be able to adjust your farmer eyesight to more diversity. Normally in monoculture, conventional farming, if you can't tell what the crop is from the road, somebody's messed up. An intercrop will look quite diverse. It will look like something that lacks uniformity. There'll be different balances of crops depending on where it is in the landscape position in the different areas of the field. That's normal. That's not a bug in the system, it's a feature of the system, but it's something that you have to adjust your expectations to be able to deal with that. You also need to adjust for the unpredictability of it. You don't really control the balance of those crops when you plant them together. You influence it, but you don't control it. So the ultimate outcome is the proportions of those crops is going to be whatever those crops manage to determine. It shakes out in the end. And you have to adapt to whatever you end up with for your being able to get it in the bin and separate it. Give yourself the gift of time and patience. This is not going to be easy, and it's best to start small. It's best to start with a small amount of acres and make your mistakes on a small amount of acres rather than making them on big acres, because that's expensive. And don't expect to have this all figured out rapidly. Also, start with 1 or 2 plant combinations your first year so that you're not trying umpteen different combinations all at once and trying to deal with the complexity of that many new intercrops in 1 year. So start slow and start small. Resiliency and profitability are bottom line. The main reasons that people are intercropping successfully and longer term. If you don't have good solid profitability and some risk mitigation, you're not likely to be able to keep intercropping as much as you might want to be building soil health and things. In the short to medium term, you still need to achieve profitability. and manage your cash risks. So that's something just to try to focus on, and let the other stuff come along with it. So now we can actually talk about crops. If we're talking about conventional farmers who want recourse to herbicides, then a lot of the time we're starting off talking about oilseeds and pulses. So your pulses are your nitrogen fixers. They're a large seed. Most of the oilseeds are quite small. This is a combination that can be generally readily separated after harvest, and there are some herbicides that can be used on both. That depends on the individual oilseeds, what you can potentially use. So these are fairly basic level intercrop combinations that are good for starting with. So canola and peas is an OG intercrop combination. This is probably the combination that most people have heard of or are familiar with. This was going on in the 90s. It largely fizzled out some when the InVigor canolas, the herbicide systems came in for canolas, and the genetics improved on the peas such that the canola and pea intercrop wasn't providing as many advantages as it was prior to those improvements in the crops. There are still some good reasons for growing canola and peas together. Some of them is reduction in some of the risk with cash costs with either the canola and the peas. They can still help hold up the peas because a lot of areas still have trouble with those semi-leafless peas lodging on them. And then reducing the nitrogen requirements of the crop, giving you some risk mitigation around some of the pests, which we have a lot of places have canola pests and pests with the peas. Flax and lentils is one that I haven't worked on very much, but seems to work nicely for a lot of people, mostly with the large greens, because that's easier to separate from the flax. You do have to watch things like cracked lentils. You don't want damaged lentils and try to separate damaged lentil chips from flax. Nobody wants to buy that kind of flax with lentil chips in it. So flax and chickpea is one that I've worked on for quite a long time. It's probably not suitable for the north, but I know some people have been somebody tried it up around Prince Albert in Saskatchewan. So I'm not going to tell you don't do it, but it's probably not one of the first choices that you would go to in the north. The camelina and lentils is definitely would be an interesting thing to try in the north. Camelina can be seeded in the fall, and it can be seeded early in the spring. It is very frost tolerant, and it is resistant to flea beetles, which are a problem in a lot of areas. It works pretty nicely with lentils or peas as a relatively early harvested intercrop. The seed of camelina is tiny, and it threshes better in an intercrop than it does as a monocrop. The 3 farmers that contracts camelina production, they actually contract intercrop production exclusively because there's less problems with their production and they like the quality better of the camelina. So that's the first instance I've ever heard of where a grain company was contracting specifically exclusively intercrop production. Now, you'll see there's another column of cereals, and you can do nitrogen fixers and cereals together, so you can do combinations of some of these things. Cereals are quite competitive overall. Things like canary seed and corn, less so, but they don't always play nicely with others, and they're also more intermediate in size for the most part. So a little bit harder to separate effectively from the peas or lentils or fava beans. Not impossible to separate, but it's just something to be more aware of. With those combinations, there's also potential to have a mixed feed grain. So you may be able to produce a pea oat or a pea barley that is just used as a feed grain. Now, you can do things that are triple crops. So a canola, lentil, wheat, possibly. There's people that are doing triple crops at scale commercially. That takes an extra level of grain separation. It tends to be more competitive with weeds when you have 3 crops there, so particularly relevant to organic production. But this is not a beginner level intercrop especially for separation, if you want to have 3 crops together. Now, why do I have the oil seeds and the cereals not next to each other? There's not a lot of advantages to putting 2 non-nitrogen fixtures together, but some people have found that putting flax with some of their cereals improves the mycorrhizal soil health, and that there might be some advantages to that. But you're probably less likely to see increases in profitability or real cash benefits to doing those. So there'll be maybe more soil health benefits. So since we are in the north, I think it's worth getting off of just the mixed grain intercropping and talking a bit more about forage and forage seed production and companion crops to go with that, because that is intercropping. It's an older thing that we might not think of as intercropping, but it is intercropping. So there's a lot of different kinds of clovers, biennials and perennials particularly, that require seed production, and the northern areas tend to be the areas where that's most feasible. So there are companion crops that you can grow with those. So you seed your clovers or your whatever forages with a cover crop or companion crop, and then harvest that crop for grain. And the forage seed, hopefully, the forage crop has hopefully established in the understory, and in the second year will be able to either produce a forage crop or forage seed. So this is more feasible for grain farmers to produce forage seed than to just start growing hay or green feed. So that's something that people should be thinking about as a way of diversifying. It means you're only going to have to seed once to get 2 years of production at least. And it's also extremely low disturbance. You're not having to disturb the ground for almost 2 years after you seeded the initial time. So that's something that people can try. Now, this is a companion crop, not a smother crop. So you are probably going to be sacrificing some on for the seeding rate and the yield of your companion crop. So you, especially with cereals, cut the rate of your seed and try to limit it in its competitive ability so that you've got moisture and sunlight still reaching your understory. That takes some practice, and if you can get some recipes, instructions from someone local that has tried this a few times, that will give you a better starting point for what rates to use. Forage seed companies would have some guidelines. I'm hoping to do a trial this upcoming year on perennial ryegrass grown with oats and varying the oat rate to see what works well. Now, which brings up a point. You can do your own trials with this, with varying the seeding rate of the companion crop, and then just go out there and look at where was that forage seed established most successfully. It should be quite visual, and that will provide you some guidance on your own land under with your own equipment on what you maybe should be doing in a subsequent year. Now, of course, that varies from year to year. So if you have a dry year, a particular seeding rate may work really well, and on a more wet year, that might not be the right seeding rate. That's always a balancing act. Forage seed markets. I'm hearing that there's organic premiums for forage seed that people should, if anyone's doing organic production, should check that out. So considerations, how do you decide which of these you're going to do? One of the first things you need to figure out as a conventional farmer is what do you want to spray, and that may dictate which crops you put together. What kind of weed pressure do you have, and what do you need to be able to control? And then the next is what can you sell or use. When I do intercrop presentations in the Dakotas or in Montana, in some of those areas, there's relatively few markets for crops, and there's only certain things that they can feasibly take to market. In your area, I don't know what you can economically get to market. So that's something to put in some research on. Which of those, of the potential list of crops, can you feasibly produce and sell? And then what can you separate efficiently? Someone asked me, what if you grew canola and flax together? We call it playing the intercrop game. You start coming up with combinations of crops, and people will tell you why that is or is not a good idea. Putting flax and canola together is a terrible idea because it is very difficult to separate. So even if there was, mycorrhizal benefits to growing the two crops together, the separation headaches is insurmountable. So don't do that. Whereas something like a flax and a cereal grain is possible to separate, but your flax might still be a bit dirty. It might be an extra cost to try to get that sufficiently clean. You need to watch herbicide residuals for at least two crops, rather than just one. So be really aware of that. And then you always have to take into account your volunteers. Are you going to be able to control your volunteers with a herbicide? And if not, can you separate those volunteers from the two crops that you're already putting in? That's one of the reasons that I tend to use oilseed pulse intercrops, because we can spray out the volunteer cereals. So that's just something to be aware of and plan your rotation. You already have to do that as farmers, but now when you're throwing in intercrops, it adds to the complexity. So this is just another thing that takes some extra forward planning. So competitive ability of the different crops varies. Some of them are quite competitive, some of them are not. You wouldn't even think of flax as being that competitive. It's actually quite competitive with most pulses, but not with cereals. Cereals are generally more competitive than most oilseeds. So we're trying to balance those things. There's variation in traits like lodging, maturity, heights, seed size among varieties and market classes of our grain crops. So within peas, there's maple peas, there's marrow fat peas, there's yellows, there's greens, there's a few different kinds. There's different sizes and types of lentils, and some of them that have herbicide tolerance, some of them that don't. And then within oilseeds, there's different maturities, there's different herbicide tolerances. So that's all things, once you've decided which crops you want to grow, then you have to figure out which market classes or varieties are you going to grow to be able to optimize profitability of your intercrop or optimize the practicality of it. Matching maturity is pretty crucial. And maturity does vary some from year to year, so it's not entirely predictable, but as long as you can get it within a few days and have crops that time it so that you're not going to be having a lot of harvest losses and crop falling in the ground, then it works fairly well. But this is one of the pitfalls of intercropping. This is where the experienced intercroppers sometimes have disappointments, is having some of their crop ending up on the ground while they're waiting for the other crop to be ripe. And moisture conditions can affect things a lot. So if you know you're going into probably a dry soil with little snow cover, then that may influence what you decide to grow. What about crop rotations? Sometimes people ask me this like a gotcha question, like I have obviously not thought about crop rotations. Of course I have thought about crop rotations. I've been working on this for a lot of years. And I've been working in agronomy for about 20 years. So how do you do intercropping rotations? It's more complex. There are basic principles of crop rotation, which is that growing multiple crops in sequence allows you to break pest cycles. Some crops like to be on residue of pulses, or they do better on residue of certain types of crops. So you try to take that into account. You're still going to need to rotate herbicides if you use them. If you're organic, then you don't need to worry about that. And you don't have to intercrop everything in rotation. This is not an all-in or all-out situation. Even the most experienced intercroppers that are really into intercropping tend to max out at half of their acres. They will intercrop their broadleaf crops and then alternate that with monoculture cereals so that they have some herbicide means of control, at least at some points in their crop rotation. So do they eliminate weeds? Definitely not. It tends to shift their weed profiles so that the weeds that they have will change, but they're still going to have some weeds. The alternating a broadleaf intercrop with a cereal monocrop, I mentioned that. That also gives you the ability to control volunteer cereals in an intercrop. So a 4-year rotation works really nicely with that, 2 broadleaf intercrops and 2 cereal monocrops. Now, that doesn't mean you can't do pulse cereal intercrops, but you just have to, you might end up alternating that with an oilseed monoculture then of canola, let's say. So it's just something that requires some planning and thinking ahead of time. And sometimes people think this means turning a wheat canola pea rotation into a wheat piola rotation, and that is just not sensible. It's not something that I'm promoting or suggesting, and I hope people are not doing it. If anything, you probably are going to end up in a 4+ year rotation once you're starting on intercropping. We're embracing diversity here, not just trying to shorten the rotation. Now, so part of rotation is knowing about the pest cycles and trying to manage pest cycles by planting crops that will reduce problems. So Aphanomyces is a problem in pea and lentil. So in places where they have Aphanomyces, you don't want a lot of pea and lentils in your rotation. You don't want 2 of those crops in a 4-year cycle, particularly. But you could have non-hosts like faba beans or soybeans in that rotation, and in that way you're not actually increasing your risk for Aphanomyces. With clubroot, it's the same thing. You don't want to have more than 1 host for clubroot in a 4-year rotation. That doesn't mean you can't put in something like a flax, which is not a host for clubroot. So it's just the same principles, but with more complexity. So what about the organic growers? I'll assume there's some in this call. The intercropping works really well for organic growers for a number of reasons. Some of the same ones as for conventional, but some different. You want to avoid volunteer separation problems. That is one of the primary things. So plan your crop sequence to make sure that you can separate your crops effectively. Triple intercrops are more common with organic growers because you're not trying to plan around what herbicides you can use. And you've got weed pressure that you need to work with. And triple intercrops are quite competitive. The cereal pulse intercrops are also quite competitive, and the economics may work out better for organic cereal intercrops with pulses than conventional ones, because the cereal pulse intercrops can be quite large volume, and for conventional farmers, not a lot of value per bushel compared to oilseeds. And since your separation costs are generally incurred on a per volume per bushel basis, it can get cost prohibitive to separate things like pea and oats or pea and barley. But if you're organic, you've got some extra value in that crop, so that can help you to pay for the separation costs. You should also be looking at underseeding for either as a cover crop or forage to try to manage your weeds situation. So things like your perennial weeds like thistles, or I'm not sure what you have in your area for problems. But you can underseed something like a clover or possibly even alfalfa under an intercrop or under a monoculture. And then that crop will carry on, suppress weeds. You might end up plowing it up the next year, or you might let it go and have it make something of itself the following year. It just depends on what your goals are. But like I said, check out the forage seed markets for organic production. And then, so primarily your issues here are going to be weed control and nutrition. The intercropping will help with nitrogen fixation for your crop production, because you're not having to alternate between a non-nitrogen fixing year and a nitrogen fixing year. You have nitrogen fixing going on at the same time as you're growing a grain crop that doesn't do its own nitrogen fixing with using rhizobia. So this is definitely of interest to organic growers, and upland organics in southern Saskatchewan, or kind of south of Regina, has been doing quite a lot on the organic intercropping with reduced tillage, and they're good ones to talk to about this. So how do you seed intercrops? You first start with what kind of seeding equipment do you have. There's so much variation in the seeding tools available in the prairies that's kind of where you have to start. So do you have double shoot capabilities? Do you have the ability to sideband, and can you place one of those seeds deeper than the other? Do you have mid-row banders that could be used? Is the mid-row bander system going to provide decent seed bed packing, or is it going to create a decent seed bed? These are all questions you need to look at. Is your seeder capable of doing this? You can do this with a single shoot system, but it is going to mean that you're making 2 passes, or either that, or you use a Valmar to broadcast one of those crops and then harrow a packet or whatever to try to make sure that you get establishment. So that's a pretty old school way of doing piola, would be broadcasting the canola and harrow packing it, and that's a high disturbance kind of scenario. So you look at your equipment. Seeding rates are a bit tricky. And regional, But in general, you want to, most of the time you're trying to seed enough of that nitrogen fixer to actually be able to be the nitrogen production factory. And otherwise, if your pulse just gets overwhelmed and outcompeted and you end up with 2 bushels of peas in with your canola or your cereal, nobody wants to bother separating that. It's not economical to separate 2 bushels of peas from some other crop. So you want a decent balance of the 2 crops. You can influence that with seeding rates, but you can also influence it with nitrogen. So most of the time with these intercrops, they're using no added nitrogen or reduced nitrogen compared to what the monoculture's oilseed fertility rates would be. So if you want to grow half a canola crop and 60% of a normal pea crop or 80% of a normal pea crop, which is a good goal, then you should be thinking about fertilizing for half a canola crop. How much fertility do you need to apply to grow half a canola crop, and then adjust your fertility based on that. You have to watch where you're going to put this fertilizer or how you're going to apply it, because seed safety is an issue. And if you're fully utilizing your drill, putting 2 crops down and metering 2 crops separately, then you may have to find an alternate way of putting down some phosphorus or sulfur or whatever fertility that you're wanting to apply. There's not much point in putting a lot of nitrogen fertilizer on most of these intercrops, because what you usually will result in is favoring one of those crops heavily and not necessarily getting more total yield. You'll just get more of one and less of the other. So profitability optimization usually means that you're reducing nitrogen applications. Harvest. This is a kind of more of a mental obstacle than a real in the field obstacle. You need to be flexible. Prepare to be flexible. Don't get rid of the swather. And be prepared to desiccate based on your conditions. One of it's a good idea to pick what's your main crop and what's your companion crop, because if it does come down to making some difficult decisions around timing of harvest, timing of desiccation, timing of swathing, you want to know where your main part of your value is. A lot of the time that's the pulses, but not necessarily. It depends what your plans were with that crop. So you time harvest to optimize value and quality, minimize shattering, minimize quality losses from things standing out in the field too long. That's where, if you can find more experienced farmers to talk to, I can help some, but being able to talk to farmers about some of the settings on your combine, or what moisture to take things off of. That's something that there's some farmer experience out there and very little research knowledge on how to do this well. So go make farmer friends. And if you're not already, you should get yourself on Twitter to be able to do that. There's a lot of intercropping farmers on Twitter that have been really good about sharing information and answering questions, and I help with connecting farmers to other farmers to be able to get their questions answered. So how do you harvest that? Aside from the obvious answer of with a combine, the way you harvest it is you generally are setting your combine for the larger seed and then turning the wind down a little to make sure that your smaller seed is not blowing out the back. Most of the time that still means you're getting rid of the trash, the non-grain material. It'll be a little messy, but you should get a sample that you can that is acceptable, considering you're going to be separating this and you're going to be doing an extra step of of cleaning out some junk while you're separating the two grains. The pulses can thresh the flax bolls. This takes some practice. The larger pulses, the rough ones like chickpeas, are a little better at this than some of the smaller seeded ones, but it is possible if you have a lot of flax and very little of the, rather little of the pulses, that doesn't really provide enough crushing power going through the combine for it to work out. So that's a danger scenario. Like somebody I know had done some dry beans with flax, and the flax outcompeted the dry beans quite a lot. And then when they went to combine them, they couldn't get it to thresh. They couldn't thresh the flax without crushing the beans. So the way that you do that is by making sure that you've got lots of pulses and relatively little flax, and trying to make sure that you have that balance. So try small areas to get some experience with this, with particular intercrops, before you scale them up big, because you don't want something that you can't effectively harvest. There are easy ones and there are more advanced ones, crop combinations. So that's something to research and get more information on. For people that are nervous about flax because of residue problems, if you're seeding 10, 12, 15 pounds an acre of flax with another crop, that is nowhere near the residue problem the following year that a monoculture flax crop would be. It's just completely different. It breaks down quick. It actually is nicer for catching snow and protecting soil than a monoculture pulse. So the intercroppers really like having things like canola or flax in with their oilseed, in with their pulses, to provide better protection for their soil and snow trapping. Good example. This is Kurt Miley-Mackey's field of chickpea flax in Montana, where they definitely need to catch snow. And that is a much more robust residue with the flax in there to trap snow than a chickpea would be on its own. And the other one there is pea canola, Chris Jorgensen from Alberta. If you can use a stripper header to take that off, you'd have really nice residue. That is still a better residue, more robust residue that's going to break down more slowly and catch more snow than a pulse would be on its own. So this is an extra benefit that that you can consider. If I don't know if you can do winter cereals in your area, but being able to seed winter cereals into a pea canola stubble would be better than a straight pea because of snow trapping. How do you separate it? You can separate most things, but it comes down to, is it economical to separate? So the easiest separation, the cheapest separation, a beginner level, is the dockage cleaners, like the KwikCleans and the rotary screens. They don't have a lot of flexibility. They're less than ideal for doing large volumes, but it's a good place to start. They're quite available and not expensive. It will cost you about 25 cents a bushel to use one of these dockage cleaners. If you have to take it somewhere and have a proper seed cleaner do your seed separation, you're probably looking at 50 cents to $1 a bushel, and that can start eating up your profits pretty quick. So it's something to be aware of and watch. So seed size difference is important for being able to make this economical. If you end up in a bind and have to use color sorters, that's going to get expensive, but it is possible. So if you have relatively small volumes that you need to deal with, or you're doing organic, or you have a high value crop, then color sorters is a really neat technology that really wasn't feasible 10, 20 years ago. So that's pretty neat. This is David Ediger's pretty common basic setup. He's in Manitoba. So this is a KwikClean. The green thing out under the truck is a KwikClean. It's got some little rotary screens that work in it. It's a dockage cleaner. And there's augers going off in a few directions. This is how most people do their on-farm basic intercrop separation when they're, at least when they're first starting out and don't have a huge amount of acres. So you might spend a few days doing this in the fall. So it's nice to avoid doing this in January because nobody wants to be standing out there doing this in January. The people with a lot of acres usually end up scaling up to having their own separation inside a building so that they can separate more comfortably for more days out of the year. And well, there's some investment there, but they're getting enough benefits from their intercrops to justify that investment. So this is acres for 2018 and 2019 that for Saskatchewan. So it gives you an idea of which type of intercrops are being grown. That varies from year to year depending on who is insuring their crops and who is what they decide to grow from year to year. So you can see there's a range. There's about 40,000 acres for 2020 that Saskatchewan Crop Insurance knows of. In 2019, the total acres was 72,000, which is was quite high. That's for what Saskatchewan Crop Insurance knows of. Anyone who is intercropping and isn't a client of Saskatchewan Crop Insurance does not appear in those numbers. And that does account for tens of thousands of acres of non-clients that are intercropping. So we don't have good numbers on how much people are intercropping, but it is being done at commercial scale. It is being done at commercially relevant scales that I think is worth paying attention to. This is an intercrop that we did in 2017. We grew large green lentils in Redvers. Redvers area is not someplace that you would normally grow large green lentils because large greens lodge quite badly. And these things grew quite tall, climbed all the way up the yellow mustard, and stood up that way right up to harvest. And harvest just lovely. The monocrop that we grew for comparison was lodged badly, and we got a yield benefit from intercropping, or we call it a land equivalency ratio, but there was over yielding from this intercrop, and largely that's going to be because the crop is held upright. You've got light interception going through a pretty complex canopy, and that can mean more productivity. So this is, I think this is a brown mustard and lentil that he's combining there. This is our little plot combine, little old plot combine. So that's what that looks like. It feeds in really nice. Intercropping is an interesting challenge to farmers, to research farms, for agronomists, for commodity groups, for grain companies, for everyone, because it's basically a different paradigm, a different model of how we're doing crops that impacts all kinds of assumptions and ways that we grow our crops. It's a steep learning curve for farmers and everyone else, and that's all right. There's really interesting potential for variable rate seeding of more than one crop at a time, and variable rate fertilizer application. That's usually requiring some extra help with making those maps and trying to figure out what the rates will be. You can do strip trials in your own field quite easily by varying the seeding rates or fertility rates. And then one easy way of getting out of assessing it is just going out and looking at it, or counting pods, counting plants to see what your outcomes are, to help you guide you on what was successful and what wasn't. So with our chickpea flax, it's really visually obvious, but we can also count the pods. You know, some plants, you have a plant that has 8 pods and some that will have 16 and some that will have 4. It's not hard to figure out that the ones with really low pods per plant are not really very practical. So you can visually get a pretty good idea of what is a good balance of those crops and what is not. You're not going to be able to rely on your yield monitor to tell you how much of each crop you've got. In fact, your yield monitor may be fairly meaningless. Your protein or moisture on your crop is whatever your combine says is going to not really mean anything. So the way you tell the moisture of your crop and whether it's safe to store is by hand separation of the crop and then moisture testing it. So you can't just do it as a mixed crop. So there's a lot of work yet to be done. This is experimental. There's people making good money on intercropping using these practices, but they put in a lot of work in figuring out what's going to work in their area, and then put in some time to fine-tune their system. It just requires more boots on the ground, literally. So it's not something that you can just phone it in. It's a challenge, but I think people that are doing it are having a lot of fun with it and making money. And if you can have fun and make money while you're farming, then that's pretty good. So like I said, I'm happy to help people try to optimize things. I can take phone calls, I can take emails. You can get a hold of me on Twitter also. Twitter's not a very scary place. And there's this hashtag called Intercrop Innovators you can use to try to connect with other people that are intercropping. So go to that hashtag, you'll find other research farms, other farmers, agronomists, different people that are working on intercropping to be able to help you get started in this if that's what you want to do. And if at the end of this you decide this sounds way too much trouble, then it probably is, and you probably shouldn't do it. And that's just the reality is not everybody is going to want to do this or have the interest level to be able to pursue this or be in a financial position to be able to do something that's a bit experimental. So thank you for listening to my presentation. I will be happy to take questions.